Welcome to Revenue Rehab, your one-stop destination for collective solutions to the biggest challenges faced by marketing leaders today. Now head on over to the couch, make yourself comfortable, and get ready to change the way you approach revenue. Leading your recovery is modern marketer, author, speaker, and chief operating officer at Tegrita, Brandi Starr.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Revenue Rehab. I am your host, Brandi Starr. We have another amazing episode for you today. I am joined by Jenn Steele. Jenn is the VP of Marketing at Reprise, a demo creation platform that helps companies sell their products with their product. An enthusiastic advocate for product-led growth, she is excited to get the word out about how Reprise helps companies increase their conversion rates by 60%. Jenn, welcome to Revenue Rehab. Your session begins now.
So good to be here.
I am excited to have you. And it's funny, I know that you are like the expert in PLGs, so I may have to bring you back to the couch later to talk about that. But we're going to cover something completely different today. But before we jump in, I like to do a little icebreaker, have a little woo-saw moment that I like to call buzzword banishment. So tell me, what buzzword would you like to get rid of forever?
There is a word that there is no way that I don't wince when people say it, and people often say it in the sales and marketing working together, and that's the word synergy. Absolutely hate it. Absolutely hate it.
Yeah, I think that is one of those words that most people don't truly understand the definition of synergy. And it's almost like they get tired of saying alignment. And so they just switch it up and just start saying synergy.
The meaning is great. The word itself, I think you're right. It's totally misused. And I think it's the people who tend to use it are the ones who want to appear smarter than they are. So that kind of bugs me.
Yeah, and that's probably one of the common things with the buzzwords. I can say that is one I at least don't use. I know a lot of times the words that people want to banish, I kind of cringe a little bit because I'm like, I say that all the time.
Who was it? Marketing attribution. I'm like, I used to work at Visible, for crying out loud. Like, marketing attribution, it was my jam. What are you talking about?
Yeah, that, there's so many of them, and I'm just, kind of like, shame like that. I say that word all the time, but synergy is one I rarely say. So we can put that one in the box, throw away the key. We will not say synergy while we are at the couch today.
Right.
So before we go, jump directly in, I like to set intentions. It helps to give us focus and purpose. It also lets our audience know what to expect. So tell me what brings you to Revenue Rehab today, and what would you like to be different after our session?
So a big theme in my life is that I like other people to learn from my mistakes and learn from my learnings. Okay, there's that too. Like I occasionally do things correctly and occasionally share that. But here we're talking about private equity, which is easier for me to talk about than a lot of folks who are in private equity, since I am no longer in private equity owned companies. I am now back to venture capital for very good reasons. But having worked for a couple of different private equity owned companies, there are definitely some tips that I would love for folks to understand and share so that they don't, fall into the same holes that maybe I did.
Awesome. Yeah, I know this is a hot topic. I mean, we even look at just how marketing technologies grow year over year, but the same is true for so many other industries. And a lot of startup tech companies, and not just tech companies, but that's a sweet spot, are private equity backed. And you have, a lot of times the marketers that are the head of marketing aren't super seasoned, and many are working with private equity for the first time. And so I know, and it's always hard because, nobody who's in it can really talk about it because, you don't want to throw your firm under the bus or make it, publicly talk about your challenges. So really excited to have you to kind of, pull the lid off, so to speak, and be able to give some direction and advice to those people who are trying to lead marketing, trying to grow revenue when they are PE backed. So my first question is, if you knew then what you know now, what would you do differently in how you have led marketing for PE backed firms?
Ooh, that's a great question. Well, the one thing you have to keep in mind with private equity backed firms is that yes, your board is holding you accountable, and it probably did in venture, and it does in public companies, although public companies are obviously a lot bigger usually. But these are finance guys, usually guys, sadly, or they're such finance guys, they probably pronounce it finance. And so I've learned. And so they're essentially bankers who are on a more operational board than you found in your venture-backed company. So my first presentation to private equity board, I went in having presented to venture boards. Yay, here's what marketing does. We're really cheery, and here's some metrics, and yay, and here's some tchotchkes, and aren't we happy? And that was not what they wanted to see, right? Yes, they did want to see the sexy stuff, right? We did this at this conference, we did this, and we got these people in the room, and et cetera, and so on. But fundamentally, they were more concerned about what I spent than anything else.
Okay, so spend, and I'm assuming return on spend.
Well, they look at sales for that. And so sometimes it's really hard to say, hey, marketing does some stuff too here. Now, there are the private equity firms that have the marketing playbook, right? And so where I spent most of my time did not have a playbook. Well, I kind of wish they had, because it would have made my life way easier, because I could have been like, I know what they're looking for, and whether or not I agree with it, I could just effing do it. But in the absence of a playbook, it was a lot of managing expectations around what they could see. And as much as I wanted to report on marketing generated revenue, they didn't care as much because that was in the financial section.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is the focus is being able to show the activities that are happening. So less around tying to the ROI, but showing here's what we're doing, but almost in a more, it's like, here's what we're doing, but here's what we also spent.
Right. Well, realize you're worshiping at the feet of the EBITDA, right? So unlike a venture-backed firm where you're entirely top-line revenue focused, you are very much focused in revenue minus cost.
Gotcha. Okay. But then they don't and I think where the disconnect for me is, but then you also don't want us to show ROI because you attribute that to sales.
And it could be my particular PE board. We're a little on the old school side. And so, if those of us who date back 15 years or so, back to when marketing was considered arts and crafts, well, that's still their mindset, right? And whereas a VC firm is probably more hip to the fact that marketing actually generates revenue now, that's only been something we've been talking about in the last 10 years or so. And so I believe, granted, I'm not inside their heads, I could be totally wrong here, but I believe that it's the old school perception of marketing as brand and arts and crafts, basically, that made it so hard for them to grok that I was attempting to measure marketing to revenue.
Okay. And in episode 4, I talked to Christina around her grit marketing approach to influence and really focusing on how marketing can have that influence in the boardroom. Do you have any advice, if you're working with private equity on how to get more mind share, how to bring people forward into here's what marketing really does, here's the impact, any advice on kind of making that shift in order to be more effective?
Well, it comes down to what we do as marketers all the time. Although, as Christina pointed out, we kind of suck at doing it with ourselves. But it's very much you have to meet them where they are, and where they are is in the budget. Right. And I'm fortunate. So marketing is my second career. I actually used to run IT departments. And so I've had budget responsibility for basically my entire career. And somehow I went from IT, which was the biggest cost center, to marketing, which is now the biggest cost center. And I, in fact, reported to the head of finance and administration whenever I was in IT. And as such, my discipline around budgeting is really strict. And that actually helped me a huge amount with private equity, because they care about the budget, right? They set the budget at the beginning of the year. You're stuck with it. If you're not making your revenue, you got to cut to get to the EBITDA number, because that is your goal. That's where the brains are. Are we making enough of a profit that we can sell you in 5 years, right? That's all they really like. They want a nice flip on their investment. So you have to meet them where their brain is, which is the budget, the finance, the return on investment. And then you can say, okay, here we go. But they're not going to take some of the squishy ways that sometimes we say, oh, and Brand did this, right? They'll look at that as convoluted. So that can be really difficult. And it's something that I've had to deal with on a case-by-case basis. So I don't really have as much insight as I would love to. I would love to share a rule, but sometimes they get it, sometimes they don't, sometimes they care, and sometimes they don't. Yeah.
But no, I do think that is good advice in thinking about, because I know, like, in my career, I've fought so hard to not be viewed as a cost center, to really show the value of marketing. But when you were talking about revenue minus costs, like, those numbers are they're hard. Like that math is clear. And so it is great advice to really think about, like, to put yourself in that position of, here is what they're going to look at. And, being able to justify the costs. And, even though they're not looking at marketing generated revenue, being able to draw direct lines, which when you're talking about building brands, like, that is where it is a lot fuzzier. And, you don't have those clear lines, which, given that so many startups are PE backed and brand is so important, it's kind of like, here we are in this catch-22 of, right, we got to build brand, but we got to do it with spending as little money as possible so that we've got, good math at the end.
Right. And that's where getting them excited about things. I mean, they're still humans, right? And so you can still bring the probably high-end swag into the boardroom, right? Don't expect them to be as excited about it as your A-round investor, but you can still, like, get them saying, oh, wow, yeah, okay, I can start seeing that. Invite them to events that you're like, so I mostly worked with private equity when I marketed to the enterprise. And so I did a lot of account ABM events, right? Standard, put some customers and prospects in a room, have them talk to each other, and magic happens. Invite them to the events, take them out to a nice dinner. Like, they start seeing, oh, okay, they're speaking my language. Oh, customers really love this stuff that marketing's doing. That do your own PR basically with your board.
Okay, so that goes back to, we got to do better at tooting our own horns.
Yeah.
And creating that visibility internally is kind of the key takeaway that I take from that.
And I kind of suck at it, not gonna lie. But
I mean, so many people do. It's hard to, sort of market yourself and really, because we're taught not to come across as, like, arrogant or, like, you're supposed to be humble and, all these sorts of things that are great character traits, but not as great, in the boardroom.
Especially when you're sitting in the boardroom with sales, who is way better at selling themselves than we are at marketing ourselves. And you've got the predilection of the board members to believe that revenue comes from sales. So now you're sitting there going, like, oh, hey, I'm in a great spot here. You're starting from the bottom of a hole, and that's not very good.
So, kind of what is, if we are thinking about, talking to senior marketing leaders who are looking at their next move.
Don't do it. No, sorry. I'm kidding. There are private equity owned companies that are completely amazing, and I'm sure I will probably work for one again someday, unless this podcast gets out. But
Yes, and the fact that there are challenges does not make them bad. It
Right.
just means that you can be more effective if you understand what you're walking into.
Yes.
So if someone's looking at, or considering private equity backed organizations, are there any criteria that you can say, like, is having a marketing playbook, like, is that something that is appealing? Or are there other things that people should really look for to say that, this might be a path to least resistance or at least worth it in the end?
Right. So by and large, I would say don't go private equity unless you're really good at budget. One of the things that I loved the most when I left my last private equity place at the executive goodbye dinner, the CFO raised a glass and said to Jenn, the most financially minded CMO I've ever worked with. You need, I'm not, hey, look at me tooting my own horn here. But you need to be financially minded enough that you kind of love budgeting and you love rejiggering it and you like truing it up and you like doing all of that stuff, which I do because there's something wrong with my brain. Otherwise, you're going to be miserable for a large portion of your job, because a large portion of your job as CMO at a private equity backed company is managing the budget and managing expectations around it and staying in sync with finance. And then whether or not, so I would have liked a marketing playbook just because then at least I could deliver what they expect, execute, etc. But if you're a more creative type that really likes to do their own thing and loves to be on the cutting edge, then private equity backed companies that tend to have playbooks, right? Vista owned companies, they're probably the most famous. You might want to avoid because they will cramp your style.
Okay. And that is a key consideration, because you think about, by the time someone gets to, leading marketing, whether that's VP, CMO, you have different career experiences, and some people are going to be stronger in some areas versus others. And like, that's really the, beauty of the space, is that there's a lot of paths to get to the same outcome. But in considering what kind of companies you want to go to, that is really key. Something that you mentioned that I think, whether you are private equity backed or not, that I think would be valuable is when you have a very financially minded leadership team, whether it's a board or otherwise, any advice on really pushing forward those larger expenditures that may not have a clear line to how they're going to pay off? Like that.
I mean, do it when you raised. That helps. Hey, don't ask how many contracts I got signed right after our raise.
Yeah, I guess timing is everything, and that is
timing is everything.
Be prepared.
Yeah. If you can't directly tie things to results, tie them to pain. And know your audience. If you have tech founders that you're working for, tech leaderships that you're working for, the pain is not going to be as sales driven as if you've had a go-to-market CEO, for example. So understand and play on that pain if you can't tie it straight to revenue.
That's awesome. That's I'm like, I have not worked in PE backed, but I'm like, and I don't know that I ever will, but I'm like, okay, this is a good note. Cause I know, work with a variety of different clients, and some of my clients are smaller and, backed by private equity firms. And, as I'm advising, head of marketing, like I'm like intaking all of this for, kind of my own selfish benefit.
So different, because you can take bigger bets when you're not private equity backed. And it's not that you can never take a big bet, but it's only probably with some of the more aggressive growth minded firms that you can do it. Otherwise, they're going to be conservative finance people.
Okay. And that in considering which company you're going to, understanding whether they are more, is it hyper growth, where they're a little bit more aggressive versus, more conservative in that.
Yes.
In what are the advantages? So we've talked about some of the challenges. Is there any, if someone is considering, PE backed versus VC, or, a larger public organization, like what's that personality or that thing that says like, yeah, this is where I want to be?
I mean, advantages, at least as far as I'm concerned, and I'm sure that a lot of our colleagues can list out a bunch of different ones. They usually feel a bit more stable, right? You're not on the venture roller coaster of spend, spend, spend. It's harder to fundraise than we thought, and oh my gosh, we got to spend again, right? It's a little less. It jerks you around a little bit less because honestly, from the top line revenue, how much you're going to have to spend because you know that you're worshiping at the feet of EBITDA, right? You also know that you're going to have an exit in 5 years or obviously less because they're trying for a 5-year horizon. And so assuming that you get equity as part of your package, which if you're C-suite, you probably do, you're going to get some payback there more reliably than you will from venture. So those, I think, are the two big ones that could be considered advantages.
Okay. So it's almost like choosing where you want to be is somewhat of an investment strategy. Kind of there's, there's a bigger risk. And in that risk, it's almost sort of the pain and stress that you go through in the process. Yes. But there's also a bigger reward on the back end.
Or a more reliable, there's probably a bigger venture reward, but also I have a fair amount of useless stock from some of my previous venture-backed companies. So yeah, it's that balance.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about kind of the day-to-day of, we know we got to focus on being budget minded, and talking to the finance people, with a little bit of a French accent. But in terms of actually like getting things done, are there places where you see that private equity brings challenges that you don't see other places?
You'll never grow your team fast enough. And so you will be making more trade-offs. And if you like trade-offs, I don't know who does, but so for me, I actually treat the whole budget and trade-offs thing almost like a video game, right? So for me, there's at least a little bit of fun there. But you're not going to grow as fast as you want. Like your budget is your budget and you can shift things around. So it's all about the trade-offs on the day-to-day. And so, for example, at a private equity-backed company, I had a marketing team of 5. And now I'm at a venture-backed company of about the same time, and I have a team of 12. There's a very big difference in what my team can do.
Yeah, I was having a chat, just kind of a virtual coffee with someone who connected with me on LinkedIn, and she's VP of marketing for a PE-backed firm, and she's a team of 2. And so it's her and it's one person that's more in a doer kind of role. And so just even hearing what, I mean, we're a small company, so I have my hands in a lot, but just hearing all the things that she kind of had her hands in, it was like, whoa, like when do you sleep?
Oh yeah. And you hear your venture-backed colleagues and your public company colleagues talk about doing this and that and this and that, and you're like, I'm barely surviving over here. Like we chose like one big initiative and like that's all we can do.
And that is also key as well, because there is, in those trade-offs comes a little bit of volume in, even if you've got the budget, do you have the resources and ability to actually execute?
Right. And that's why the playbooks are nice, because at least then you've got something that they'll spend on.
Right. Yeah. Because it's kind of vetted.
Yes.
Do you see where those same resourcing challenges exist in other areas of the business that then kind of bleed into marketing?
It depends on your business, obviously. Sometimes they've invested too much in ops. Sometimes they haven't invested enough. It's very strange to work at a company where the finance team is twice the size of the marketing team, but there you have it. There's the folks that are more directly tied to revenue, basically sales and finance, will tend not to have the resource constraints. And that can be to your advantage if you're suddenly like, I think sales enablement should really live over in sales. And then you've got something covered that maybe product marketing used to cover.
Okay. So and again, it is kind of those trade-offs. Like if you move sales enablement to sales, you kind of lose control over what's happening, but then you're also not accountable to that budget.
Right. It's one less thing your tiny little team has to do and spend for.
Yes. But then, it's almost like does sales enablement in sales actually work effectively, which is, debatable.
That's a completely different day.
Yeah, different battle for a different day. Okay, so anything that I have not thought to ask about that you're like, if you're in a PE backed or considering a PE backed, you've got to know this.
It's really, I said it up front, it's budget, it's numbers, it's all about the numbers. And if you don't like the numbers, don't do it.
Okay. So that is the key advice. So talking about our challenges is the first step, and nothing changes if nothing changes. And so in traditional therapy, the therapist gives the client some homework, but at Revenue Rehab, I like to kind of flip that on the tit. And I'm going to ask you to give us some homework, because when you know better, you do better. And so I'd like you to kind of summarize your key takeaways, which I think you just hit on the key point. It's about the numbers, focus on the budget.
Sorry, I jumped the gun there.
No, quite all right. But the other thing would be, what is that one thing? Like we try, so often there's, conversations and you have all these like 50 steps of things to do. And people are like, how do I get started? So if you are someone who is at a PE backed firm and let's say not feeling good about how it's going, because I'm trying to narrow it a little bit because I know there's a lot of directions, but what is kind of that one next thing? What is the first thing you can do to try and move in the right direction?
Discover where your board members are coming from, and your CFO can probably help you.
Okay, so that's that key relationship. So if we want to, invite the CFO to coffee or lunch, or I'm assuming people are in person, which is kind of a weird thing right now. But, build that relationship if you don't already have it with the CFO to understand where the board is coming from.
Right. Sometimes your CEO will help you with that, but your CFO, because it's all about the budget and the numbers, I like starting there.
Well, I have enjoyed our discussion today, but that's our time for today. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks everyone for joining us today. I hope you have enjoyed the conversation with Jenn. I can't believe that we are already at the end, but thanks everyone for joining this week, and see you next time.
You've been listening to Revenue Rehab with your host, Brandi Starr. Your session is now over, but the learning has just begun. Join our mailing list and catch up on all our shows at revenuerehab.live. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at Revenue Rehab. This concludes this week's session. We'll see you next week.